Hi, it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for another video edition of Widower Wednesday. I'm Abel Keogh, author of the book Dating a Widower, and today we are going to discuss whether or not losing a spouse is harder for men than it is for women, and how much harder is it, and what are the reasons for that if that is the case. I'm actually going to be reading an article here. I'll put the link in the description below if you want to check out the article. But the headline of the article goes like this. It says, "Losing a spouse makes men 70% more likely to die within a year." Kind of an eye-grabbing headline, isn't it? Men are more likely to die. So I posted this on some of my social media pages on Facebook and Twitter and other places, and got some interesting responses. So I thought I'd do a video on it and discuss whether or not this article tracks with what I've seen over the years. So this is how the article goes. I'm going to read the article, then I'll give my commentary. But the article goes like this. It says, "Losing a spouse forces people into what is often one of the most vulnerable parts of their lives. The negative health consequences of widowhood can stretch years down the line, but in some cases they don't get a chance to. The phenomenon in which both halves of a couple die in short succession is so common that it even has a name, the widowhood effect." So I'm going to pause here and say, if you're not familiar with the widowhood effect, it's sometimes you see stories in the news like where a husband or a wife dies, and within hours or days after the other, or even sometimes minutes, the other spouse passes away. It does happen. I wouldn't say it's extremely common, but it does happen, and yes, it does have a name. Okay, back to the article. Article says, how at risk is any given person? That depends on many contributing factors, from their religion and race, and even to their spouse's cause of death. But the widowhood effect is generally believed to be a problem primarily among closely bonded elderly couples. However, a study published March 22nd in the journal PLOS 1 finds that younger people, especially men, are even more at risk. Researchers in Denmark, the UK, and Singapore studied data from almost 1 million Danish citizens aged 65 and older, and found that the younger people were, when they lost their spouse, more susceptible they were to dying within a year. And by the way, younger here, they're talking basically in their 60s. That's their definition of young, okay? Just so we're clear on that. Back to the article. It says, overall, the researchers also found that in the year after losing a spouse, men were 70% more likely to die than similarly aged men who did not lose a spouse, while women were 27% more likely to die compared to women who did not become widowed. Okay, so again, it's not that if your spouse passes away, if you're widowed, you don't have a 70% chance of dying. You're just 70% more likely to die if you're a widower than compared to someone who isn't widowed. And if you're a widow, you're 27% more likely to die. Not that you have a 27% chance of dying. That's kind of some people read this and that's where the confusion come in. But if you're a widow, you're 27% more likely to die than a woman of the same age and background and whatnot who is married. So the researchers suggest that among men of all ages, increased mortality risk could be tied to the detrimental effects of loneliness and older age, one of the biggest risk factors for early death. A lot of these older men grew up during a time when men had certain ideas about what was appropriate and not to be masculine. Carr says men tend to rely very heavily on their spouses in heterosexual couples for their social needs to be met. Carr expects this could change gradually as younger generations grow older. Okay, so anyway, I will, again, I've posted a link to this article in the description if you want to read more. There is more that you can read, but I think those are kind of the relevant paragraphs to kind of sum things up. So this is what I've noticed over the years. So first of all, yes, and research backs this up, not just this study, but men have a harder time losing a spouse than women. And I'm not talking, I say this sometimes, people like, well, I'll have women tell me, well, I lost my spouse and it's a horrible, terrible thing. No, I get it. I'm not talking about the emotional effects of it. I'm just talking physically and health-wise. Men have a harder time with it, and I'll give my reasons here in a second, but I just want to make that clear. I'm not saying that they have a harder time grieving per se. What I'm saying is that the effects of losing a spouse are harder on men. The health effects are harder on men than they are for women, and it's not just something I've seen in studies. It is something I've observed over and over again in talking to widows and widowers, for the last 15 years. They have a very different way of dealing with grief. So here's the reasons I think it's harder on men, and they kind of touched on it a little bit on the article. So these are just my observations, and in terms of thousands of coaching sessions and 15 years of talking to people and doing this. this is my these are my observations, is that the people who are more likely to pass away, they have little or no support from a family and friends. That's kind of the first thing. So their spouse passes away. They maybe, they have, if they have children, the adult children are out of the house, and there's not a lot of support there. Maybe the kids come and they're there for the funeral to help dad, but there's not a lot of maybe just in terms of support as far as maybe checking in with dad to see how dad's doing, or doing things like that. And I think but I think even a bigger factor is that there's little or no reason for living. I see oftentimes with women, what happens when they lose a spouse is they've kind of got a good social network. Even if it's not family, they have they have friends and stuff that they can go out with. They kind of dive into something, work, hobby, something like that. And men, though, have a lot of their identity sometimes comes from being a protector and a provider. That's just where, by a default, whether or not they were the primary breadwinner or not, it doesn't matter, but they just kind of have this identity: I'm the protector, I'm the provider. And when their spouse passes away, a lot of that is ripped out from under them. I don't have anyone to support anymore. I don't have anyone to protect. And, they wake up in the morning, it's like, well, what's my reason for a living? They don't necessarily think that verbatim, but this wakes up, it's like, well, my spouse is gone, what is it that I can do? I understand that to some extent. I mean, I kind of threw myself into my job after I was first widowed, simply because that was really the only thing I had. I lost a wife, lost a daughter, really the most important things in my life are gone. The only thing I had was my job. I can't imagine how I would have reacted if I would have lost my job, but thankfully I had a kind of a understanding and supportive boss and company, and they kind of worked with me on it. But again, the only reason I was getting up in the morning was for work, which isn't a bad reason to get up, but it was a lot harder to get up and just go to work, as opposed to getting up thinking like, oh, I have a baby on the way, I have a wife to take care of, things like that. A lot less motivated to go to work. So I think with people who pass away sooner, you go back to that widowhood effect that they were talking about with couples. I think those couples are bonded so closely that when one dies, the other person is like, what's my purpose in living? And they go soon after. And so again, I think a lot of it has to do with just male psychology and things like that. And again, that's something I've seen over and over in a coaching session, is that I will talk to widowers, about dating again. Let's get a plan together for dating, or let's talk about the relationship that you're in. And I'll just kind of ask them, I'm like, well, why do you get up in the morning? That's one of the questions that I'll ask. And, what's your reason for getting up? And it's amazing. And this is regardless of age. A lot of times it's like, well, I don't know. I'm just kind of figuring things out. I don't know why I'm doing what I'm doing anymore. And typically, these tend to be older with adult children out of the house if they have kids. If they have younger kids, it's much different. If they're younger widowers and have like minor children or even teenagers at home, you get a very different response. They kind of throw themselves into parenthood a lot of times. Their kids become their top priority, and that obviously causes other issues when they start dating again. But that's not the point of this. But anyway, just some observations there. So again, yes, the takeaway from this is losing a spouse is hard. It's hard mentally, it's hard physically, it's hard spiritually. And again, it's just, I think health-wise, it's harder on men than it is for women. And I'm not talking, it's grief, it sucks losing a spouse, but I think this is also a big reason why you see men jumping into dating again sooner. Their heart is broken. They need a reason for a living here. Well, what a better way to give my life meaning and purpose again than to start dating again. Just my observations there. But I think the takeaway is from this as well, is that if you know someone that's lost a spouse, and I'm not talking about the person that you're dating, but if you know someone that, in your family or something that has lost a spouse, I think it's a wake-up call to maybe reach out to them and even just spend some time talking to them, regardless if they're a widow or widower. Just, if you know people that have recently lost a spouse, it's hard. And sometimes just having somebody to talk to, or maybe giving people a reason just to smile, is enough to keep them going through the day. So that's something to think about. I'm Abel Keogh, author of the book Dating a Widower. If you have your own comments and thoughts below, you can do that. Feel free to subscribe to this channel. You can also schedule a coaching session with me if you want. There is a link in the description as well. And I will see you all next Wednesday.